everyone, welcome to DD India. I'm Munman Bhattacharya and you are watching Connecting the Dots, a show that does a deep dive and connects the dots to get you the big picture of raging global issues. China and the Philippines have had multiple face-offs in South China Sea. So what is the whole dispute about? Is China a sea bully? We explore that in this edition. From flashing lasers to collisions and water cannons, 2023 was an incident-filled year in the South China Sea. What you see here is one such video of a recent confrontation between a Chinese Coast Guard vessel and a Philippines Coast Guard ship in the contested waters. At the receiving end is the Philippines vessel being water cannoned and rammed into. The aggressor is the Chinese vessel. At a distance, what you see is a Chinese militia vessel. What is that doing here? We'll tell you in a bit. This is yet another video, this time of a Philippines fisheries vessel being water cannoned by the Chinese Coast Guard. Here too, China is the aggressor. At the receiving end this time is a Philippines civilian vessel, not even a military vessel. This fisheries vessel was on a regular resupply mission. It was going to provide oil and groceries to more than 30 Filipino vessels in Scarborough Shoal, a shoal that is claimed by China, Taiwan and the Philippines in South China Sea. The videos were captured by the Philippines side. Philippines for some time has been trying to push back against China's muscle flexing, bullying and intimidation through its quote-unquote assertive transparency approach. Simply put, the Philippine side captures China's intimidatory tactics in the South China Sea on camera and releases them in public domain for the world to see. These standoffs have become far too frequent. For instance, this video of early December shows more than 135 Chinese maritime militia vessels scattered within the Witsun Reef in the Philippines' exclusive economic zone in South China Sea. Manila calls this reef the Julian Philippi Reef. So why are these run-ins happening in the South China Sea? What are the maritime claims of Philippines and China? Are other countries also involved in maritime disputes in this region? What is the Chinese maritime militia? And what does the international law have to say on the rights of countries in the region? To answer these questions, let's understand the dispute and why China wants to control the South China Sea. The South China Sea is situated just south of the Chinese mainland. It is bordered by Vietnam, Brunei, China, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines and Taiwan, which China claims to be its territory. The South China Sea contains 4 major island groups, and there are 6 claimants to these island groups: China, Taiwan, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia and Brunei. So what are those 4 island groups? There's 1, the Spratly Islands, 2, Paracel Islands, 3rd, Macclesfield Bank and 4th, Pratas Island and Reefs. Within these, the Spratly Islands has seen the most claims. This island group is located in one of the busiest sea lanes of communication in the world. But the first major military conflict in the South China Sea happened between China and Vietnam in 1974 over the Paracel Islands. In fact, history of bickering between states over territorial control in the sea goes back many centuries. But in recent years, tensions have soared to new heights. Before we explore the history further, let's see why is the South China Sea so important for all the players in the region. That's because it is one of the most important areas of ocean in the world. It is incredibly rich in natural resources. It is a hub of marine and hydrocarbon resources. It has 11 billion barrels of oil in deposits, 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, and 10% of the world's fisheries. Most importantly, over 21% of global trade, which comes to around $3.37 trillion US, transited through these waters in 2016. That number has since gone up. South China Sea is thus an extremely important body of water and hence the competing claims over it. Though there are other reasons too why China wants to control it and why some countries have been fiercely contesting China's maritime claims. But before we get there, let's see what the international law has to say. Most countries in the region base their claim off the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, which was adopted in 1982. UNCLOS lays down a comprehensive regime of law and order in the world's oceans and seas. It establishes rules governing all uses of the oceans and their resources. This law is pretty clear on most things. Countries have territorial seas stretching 12 nautical miles off their coast. Islands do too. Rocks and submerged features don't. Countries also have resource zones that stretch 200 nautical miles. That area that stretches up to 200 nautical miles is called the Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ, of that country. Countries have exclusive rights to all the resources and trade in their exclusive economic zones. It is there alone to fish, mine and harvest deep sea riches. So for example, any oil that is found within 200 miles off the coast of Vietnam belongs exclusively to Vietnam. But any area that is not in an exclusive economic zone is regarded as international waters, and these waters fall under the UN maritime law, which means everybody shares it. Every state is allowed to fly, sail and operate in waters beyond the territorial seas and pass freely through the straits. So does China comply with this international law? No, it doesn't. It flagrantly violates it instead. So what is China's argument? China argues it has a historical claim to the South China Sea. China traces its interaction with the South China Sea back to the Western Han dynasty. Thus, Beijing's narrative about its claims begins as early as 2nd century BCE, when Chinese people sailed in the South China Sea and discovered some of the region's land features. But scholars have meticulously catalogued the dubious nature of this history. What's more important is that the UN Convention for the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, does not grant signatories the right to make claims based on historical legacy. So the concept of quote-unquote historic claims being used by China has no basis in international law. China marks its claim using a border called the 9-dash line. Now, where does this 9-dash line come from? After World War II, Japan, that had dominated the entire region, lost all control of its surrounding areas. China used the moment to claim the South China Sea by drawing this imprecise line that you see in green on this map. This line covers 90% of the South China Sea and so virtually the entire sea. This very line is known as the 9-dash line. Its origins go back to 1947, when China, under the rule of the nationalist Kuomintang Party, issued a map with this 9-dash line. The line continued to appear in the official maps even after the Chinese Communist Party came to power. The line runs as far as 2,000 kilometers to within a few hundred kilometers of the Philippines, Malaysia and Vietnam. China sticks to that line, and even when the United Nations established the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone parameter in 1973, China stuck to its own line, even though China's line runs many miles beyond what is allowed under UNCLOS, that China has, by the way, signed. China has even refused to clarify the boundaries of the 9-dash line. It has also refuted competing territorial claims made by other countries that fall within that line. A significant turning point came in 2012 with a standoff between the Philippines Navy and Chinese fishing vessels in the Scarborough Shoal. The shoal lies about 200 kilometers off the Philippines coast and inside its exclusive economic zone. China seized the shoal, and the Philippines launched a case in 2013 against China's conduct and China's maritime claims based on its 9-dash line. The tribunal, in its ruling in 2016, rejected the 9-dash line. It concluded that there was no legal basis for China to claim historic rights to resources within the sea areas falling within the 9-dash line. So China's 9-dash line has no legal basis, neither under the international law nor under the tribunal's ruling. Other than Brunei, which has been the quietest claimant nation, China's other neighbors have rejected the 9-dash line too. The tribunal also faulted China for its belligerence. It said that China had violated Philippines' sovereign rights in its exclusive economic zone by interfering with Philippine fishing and petroleum exploration, by constructing artificial islands, and by failing to prevent Chinese fishermen from fishing in the zone. For the Scarborough Shoal, the tribunal had this to say, that fishermen from the Philippines and China had traditional fishing rights, but China had restricted these rights. It even faulted China for creating a serious risk of collision when its patrol boats had physically obstructed Chinese fishing vessels, much like what China did weeks ago. If this is not bullying, what is? The tribunal's judgment is binding, but there is no enforcement mechanism. China boycotted the proceedings and does not comply by the ruling. So China flouts the international maritime law and does not abide by the rulings of the International Tribunal either. For China, it is my way or the highway. So how does China back its maritime claims? It does that with formidable naval, law enforcement and maritime militia fleets. Remember the Chinese maritime militia vessel we talked about earlier? Just to remind you, a ship of theirs was seen lingering close to a Philippines ship. We showed you this video at the start of the show. So what is the Chinese maritime militia? The maritime militia is also called the fishing militia. It is one of the three forces that China uses in its maritime operations, other than its Coast Guard and People's Liberation Army Navy. China's maritime militia is part of their grey zone tactics. China uses the militia to wage conflict against its neighbors without crossing the threshold of conventional war. Well, the maritime militia is a particularly useful grey zone force for China because Chinese authorities can deny or claim affiliation with its members as they please or depending on the context. For instance, China can send its militia to harass foreign vessels in contested areas, just like it did with the Philippines vessel, but publicly assert that the militia vessels are independent from government control. That's a tactic to avoid escalation with other states. Simply put, China sees itself as fundamentally above the law and beyond accountability to others. China has been using other tactics as well to assert its maritime claims in the South China Sea. It has physically increased the size of islands and even created new islands altogether. Look at this satellite imagery. It shows physical changes made by China to a layered land feature at Sandy Cay. This was done between 2009 and 2021. This cay is in the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea. The Spratly Islands, as you know, are claimed by China, Vietnam, Taiwan, Malaysia, Philippines and Brunei. China not only built out reefs, islands and land formations in the area that it had long controlled and militarized them with ports, runways and other infrastructure, it has also built them on territory it did not occupy. See this excerpt from the Council on Foreign Relations. It says, in addition to piling sand onto existing reefs, China has constructed ports, military installations and airstrips, particularly in the Paracel and Spratly Islands, where it has 20 and 7 outposts respectively. China has militarized Woody Island by deploying fighter jets, cruise missiles and a radar system. Now listen to this report that summarizes it all. China relies on a range of maritime grey zone tactics to advance its interests in the seas. These include building artificial islands and military installations in the Philippines' exclusive economic zone, relying on its maritime militia to chase Filipino fisherfolk away from their traditional fishing grounds, and using military-grade lasers and water cannons to disrupt resupply missions. So why is China hell-bent on asserting its maritime claims so aggressively in South China Sea? That's because other than wanting to control the marine and hydrocarbon resources in there, China wants to guarantee its security in distant waters. China wants to expand its maritime navigation. China wants to challenge US maritime dominance and power projection in East Asia. In sum, China does not want any challenge to its regional dominance whatsoever, irrespective of what the international laws or tribunals have to say. It also wants to browbeat other claimant nations into submission with its expansionist mindset. So where does it leave other claimant states? China's maritime policies have opened the door for other states to flout the rules. This means a world in which international law has little relevance at sea. Like China, they prize the economic value of their coastal waters. They too care about their sovereignty and security. Perhaps this is why they are generally more supportive of the UN Convention's provisions than their more powerful neighbor. But in the face of muscular Chinese coercion, resorting to the protection of law carries little weight. According to this report, at least some countries in the region have been willing to follow China's lead in ignoring the rules. It mentions Japan and Vietnam. So this is what has come of China's behavior. So how does India see the dispute in South China Sea? India has consistently been calling for a free, open and inclusive Indo-Pacific region. India has been calling for peaceful settlement of disputes and adherence to international law. India has also enhanced its military and diplomatic engagement with claimant states such as the Philippines and Vietnam. Let's look at India's growing military engagement in South China Sea first. In 2019, the Indian Navy for the first time conducted joint exercises with the US, Japanese and Philippine navies. In 2021, the Indian Navy held military exercises with the navies of Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Australia and Indonesia. In 2023, India for the first time sent warships to participate in a two-day joint exercise with the navies of 7 ASEAN states. India has also significantly increased its military sales and assistance to the Philippines and Vietnam. In 2022, India reached a deal with the Philippines for the export of 100 BrahMos supersonic anti-ship missiles. In June 2023, Vietnam became the first country to receive a fully operational light missile frigate from India. In November 2023, as tensions spiked between China and the Philippines over confrontations in South China Sea, India announced that it would offer the Philippines at least 7 helicopters for rescue and humanitarian efforts of the Philippines Coast Guard, or PCG, during natural disasters. While the primary focus is on boosting search and rescue capabilities, Philippines President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. was quick to point out that the helicopters would be a big contribution for the PCG's maritime operations in general. Let's now come to India's growing diplomatic engagement in South China Sea. In July 2016, after the tribunal announced its ruling in the case filed by Philippines against China that we told you about, India said only that it took note of the award. But at the India-Philippines Foreign Ministers meeting in June 2023, India abandoned its previously cautious stance. Instead, India and the Philippines underlined the need for peaceful settlement of disputes and for adherence to international law, especially on clause and the arbitral award too in the joint statement. Now, why was this significant? It was because this was the first time that India had explicitly called upon China to adhere to the ruling, despite Beijing's persistent dismissal of its validity. But South China Sea is not the only area of confrontation in the Pacific Ocean. There is East China Sea too. Here, China, Taiwan and Japan have been disputing a group of islands called Diao by China and Senkaku by Japan. Just like the South China Sea, East China Sea is also a hub of marine and hydrocarbon resources. In East China Sea, the competition began when the UN Economic Commission for Asia and the Far East, or UNECAFE, announced that these islands were rich in hydrocarbon resources located under the continental shelf between Taiwan and Japan. This led to an escalation of competition and conflict between the claimants that wanted to exploit these resources, because these countries saw this as an opportunity to reduce their dependence on Arab states for oil and also to transition to natural gas. Another reason was fish. China, Japan and South Korea regularly exploit the region for fish and algae. This is because the East China Sea yields the highest catch of fish at slightly over 3.8 million tons. That makes for crucial food supply throughout the region because fish serves over 20% of public diets across East Asia. East China Sea also has strategic significance. That also explains the fight for dominance between China and Japan. In the north of the sea is the entrance to the Sea of Japan, while in the south there is Taiwan, which serves as a contested area between the US and China. China perceives Japan as a threat. That is why China believes that acquiring the islands will help it successfully close its security gaps. China wants to use the Diao Islands to safeguard itself from Japan and the US. Japanese military experts claim that China can use the islands to establish missile bases, radar systems and submarine bases, and thus increase China's security and military presence in the region. As far as East China Sea is concerned, sovereignty claims over the Diao or Senkaku Islands are limited to China and Japan for all practical purposes. Although Taiwan shares China's claims, it has not been a part of China's attempts to promote sovereignty over the isles, mainly because China does not consider Taiwan as a separate country. So does China feel any real threat in the two seas? It surely does. For China, Japan is a formidable military opponent in the East China Sea compared to any other South China Sea claimant. This is because the main claimants of the South China Sea, such as Vietnam and the Philippines, have significantly less military presence or modernization capabilities than China. Vietnam only has a respectable military force, while the Philippines' armed forces are even less impressive in terms of numbers than Vietnam. By comparison, Japan's Maritime Self-Defense Force consists of nearly 47,000 personnel. The force has an equally impressive air force. Japan Coast Guard has been modernizing and building its capabilities for the long-term defense of the islets. To put it simply, Japan's military and Coast Guard forces pose a much more significant threat to the Chinese PLA Navy than Vietnam or the Philippines. But the most crucial part of Japan's military capabilities is the support of the US military. Washington fully supports Japan's administration over the Senkaku Islands, and if China were to try to acquire the Diao Islands, it would mean a direct confrontation with Japan's modern Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard and the US military. So China feels threatened by Japan and its alliance with the US. Moreover, compared to Japan, where the US has its military forces stationed throughout the country and also prepared for a potential China-Japan conflict, there is a lack of permanent and imposing US military presence on the Filipino shores, and therefore, Philippines' alliance with the US is less of a threat to China than Japan's alliance with the US. So what is the solution to these disputes in South China Sea and East China Sea? Well, the South China Sea dispute is multilateral and the East China Sea dispute is bilateral, as you know. Since multiple countries have overlapping claims over the Spratly Islands and the Paracel Islands in the South China Sea, these parties have taken diplomatic steps to resolve the disputes. Negotiations from ASEAN, which is a 10-member regional grouping, and China have so far produced a non-binding declaration on a code of conduct in 2002. Then came the principles on the implementation of the declaration in 2011, then a framework for a code in 2017, and then a single draft negotiating text in 2018. But despite China's declarations and ASEAN's eagerness to create a final code of conduct, there still is no such code of conduct yet. Ask us why. China simply does not want a solution. China wants status quo because that benefits it more than any binding agreement or code of conduct with ASEAN can. So what is the outcome of these talks? Well, after 25 years of talks between China and ASEAN, there is still no South China Sea code of conduct because China has been stifling diplomatic efforts to reach one. No wonder a code of conduct for the South China Sea remains as elusive as ever. And so there is no binding instrument between China and ASEAN that can reduce the risk of conflict in South China Sea. So what does the future look like in these contested waters? Well, China might prefer the status quo of bullying others in the region, but others are pushing back. For instance, Philippines is now looking to sign a reciprocal access agreement with Japan in 2024. It will help them share military forces on each other's territory. Philippines president is seeking more defense partners. Philippines has agreed to start negotiations with France for a defense deal permitting troop visits. Philippines conducted its most extensive signature military drill with the US in 2023, the largest in over 3 decades. There are also reports that the Philippines is exploring conducting joint patrols with other like-minded friendly countries in the South China Sea after it completed a similar patrol mission with Australia and the United States. That's not the only pushback in recent times. In August 2023, the Philippines, Malaysia, Taiwan and Vietnam rejected as baseless a map released by China. The map denotes China's latest claims to sovereignty, including in the South China Sea. In that map, China went further in its sovereignty claims. The map had a line with 10 dashes. That included Taiwan. This is more than its 9 dashes. Taiwan said it was absolutely not a part of People's Republic of China. Malaysia filed a diplomatic protest, and Vietnam said China's claims have no value and they violate Vietnamese and international laws. Simply put, other players in the region are not succumbing to Chinese tactics. But the future of the South China Sea has global implications as jurisdiction over a few seemingly minor islands legitimizes control over vast amounts of sea. This in turn enables access to valuable mineral and fishing resources. This also denies warships from traversing waters through which a significant amount of global trade passes. The question now is, after scaling back its Belt and Road Initiative, will China be now forced to do a retreat in these contested waters? Only a coordinated response by those impacted by Chinese bullying can do the trick. That's it in this edition of Connecting the Dots. We'll see you next week with more raging issues. Until then, it's a goodbye from all of us in a Delhi newsroom. Take care and stay safe.